Hello Goshen friends, my name is Payne. During this crazy season, it has become clear to me that one of the most difficult issues for a lot of people, including myself, has been the challenge of being empathetic, especially with people we disagree with. Since stepping down as a pastor at Goshen in 2016, I've been providing coaching and care for Christian leaders and pastors. Most weeks, I meet with over 20 clients, and there is nothing more important than empathetic listening in providing needed care. While I find it fairly safe to express empathy and grace to those in my care, it is difficult for me and my clients to consistently show empathy to those very close to us or those who may have very different perspectives or beliefs. In the craziness of the season, the most difficult empathy is certainly listening to and pursuing the emotions and perspectives of people with whom we disagree. I'm not going to address the specific issues that people are disagreeing over, but because they are many and not getting easier, I'd like to share some reflections on the challenges we face in trying to love each other. A helpful text on this subject is Romans 12, and I will take a few minutes at the beginning to reflect on verses 15 through 18. I believe all Christians have a role in impacting the world for Christ. And in order to have that impact, we must embrace leadership in creating safe spaces for connection. Empathy is an expression of the grace of God in Christ and can be a pathway for people to more fully understand and receive God's love and grace offered to all people through the gospel. So the plan for today is to first share a few reflections on the invitations and exhortations found in these verses from Romans 12. Secondly, present some basics of empathetic listening. Third, discuss what can make empathetic listening so difficult at times. And fourth, just share a few thoughts about being heard. Let's hear the words from Romans 12, 15 to 18. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. This first verse, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep, is a powerful invitation. It's an invitation to join in the emotions or acknowledge the perspective of another, and this is kind of the basic way we connect. We see this happen in large events where crowds are cheering together, and we also see this in the most intimate space when a loved one is hurting and we shed a tear with them for a loss experienced or a wound received. We often think of being sad with someone who is sad as the essence of empathy, which it is. However, to rejoice with those who rejoice is also empathy, and it is kind of the very definition of what you might call positive empathy. I often picture this as the child who points at something with great hope that the parent or caregiver will look at it, and they sit there and they say, they point and they look, and the parent looks in that direction, and the truth is sometimes there's nothing there. The only reason is the deep need in the little soul for someone to take their perspective and be excited with them. When my wife gets excited about a cute dog, I don't have to love dogs as much as she does. But it is important for her to know how happy I am that she's happy about them. Well, in this verse, Paul is simply naming one of the most basic of all needs, to be heard. And of course, it's not just to be heard, it's to feel like another person can feel and understand what they are feeling. And this is a basic way we love others. The second phrase is live in harmony with one another. This admonition is rehearsed over and over in the writings of Paul. Topics like mutual submission, being generous in meeting the needs of others, being patient with people who have different views, like later in Romans where he taught on whether to eat food sacrificed to idols, where there was disagreement. So living in harmony does require empathy. And similar to empathy, living in harmony requires really hearing and understanding the feelings and thoughts of others with whom we have intimate relationships. We will not necessarily have harmony with everyone, but we will have harmony as best as we can with those in our closest circles. This doesn't mean total agreement, but is more in line with kind of reasonable submission. All right, so the next verse, do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly, never be wise in your own sight. This verse challenges our assumption that it's better if we only associate with those who are like us or are in agreement with us. So Paul's inviting us to kind of embrace humility and let go of any prejudice about who we care about. That we are never too good to be with others broken in different ways than us. Yes, we too are the lowly. And Jesus shows us that it is the conceited, those who think they have got it all together, that struggle to live in harmony. Next verse says, repay no one evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. Well, this verse really pushes us towards forgiveness and forbearance, not demanding judgment too quickly, and to instead embrace grace. There are ways to conduct ourselves in response to the strong attack of others. We do not need to respond with harshness or evil, but can instead seek to be respectable and godly. Sometimes empathy towards those hurting us can have a powerful impact on them. When I was a senior in high school, I fell in love with the game of basketball and began to play every chance I got, including every day at lunch. So one day, a fellow student who I knew really well because we both played trumpet in band and jazz band, and I knew him from the time I was very young. Anyway, while we were playing basketball, he became enraged at me and hit me violently with the ball. Well, by God's grace, instead of fighting back, I simply told him, obviously, you're having a bad day. I'll see you tomorrow. So with permission, I went home. And when I came back the next day, he apologized. And then, probably because of my gracious response, felt safe to really share with me that he was in trouble with the police for getting a girl pregnant. The truth is, we do not need to condone choices to grant compassion. While this may be an unusual story, and I certainly haven't always had such clarity, it does illustrate why this verse, in the context of empathy, points to a response that can provide a real opportunity for connection with even those who hurt us. So the last verse says this. It says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Wow, living peaceably with all is a tall order in our world today. It was then. It's still hard. This is the reason I've long chosen not to engage in debating or argumentation in our social media platforms, because it is not a relationship. If I can't look a person in the eye and kind of work out that dynamic, personally, I have no interest in simply trying to convince, criticize, or cajole just so my ideas get heard. Our deep longing to be heard may lead us astray in how we treat others in our speech. We're never as thoughtful or careful when we criticize others through email, text, letter, or in social media. People, including Christians, are saying terrible and awful things to each other outside of a personal relationship context. Living peaceably with all has been lost by those who are using new modes of communication to demand a hearing without having to do any listening. Living peaceably with all does not require that I agree with the feelings or beliefs of others. But Jesus definitely invites us to love others through listening and gentle sharing of our beliefs. His harshest words are for the religious who think they have it all figured out. Missionaries who reach others for Christ are always focused on loving their neighbors by listening to their struggles from their cultural perspective. And then after a time, they find those same neighbors are often ready to hear their story of following Christ. I'd now like to share some thoughts on empathy. I truly believe that without empathetic listening, it is difficult to engage in deeply meaningful relationships. Most of the time, when people share their thoughts and feelings, they just want to be heard. I believe empathy leads to listening, and listening can lead to mutual submission and harmony, even when there are disagreements. So what is empathy? Well, Brené Brown describes it as perspective taking, where we listen to what someone else is feeling and connect with the emotions they're expressing because we too have had similar emotions. We're not required to internalize what they are thinking or feeling, but we are invited to help name what they are expressing so they know they have been heard. It is difficult to do this naming without being connected to our own emotions and experiences. We don't feel for someone, we feel with them. So let's say my son comes to me and is upset with something his mom said to him. Perhaps I think that what my wife said was legitimate. In that case, I'd be tempted to dismiss his feelings and try to correct him. However, the first thing he needs is to feel heard and feel safe sharing his emotions. Even if I believe he is wrong, if I reject what he's feeling and try to simply correct him, he will likely not feel heard and will have a difficult time hearing anything further I have to say. Empathy would be for me to simply listen to what he is sharing, notice his emotion, and then reflect what I'm hearing and say, I can feel how upset you are by what your mother said, and try to be as specific as I can. In most cases like this, once being heard, the person will then start seeking clarity on what to do about their thoughts and emotions. In this example, once my son has felt heard, he may say, I don't know what to say to her. Then I can suggest he simply go and tell her what he's feeling, work it out with her. Again, in most cases where we're not the one at issue, our role is to be empathetic and simply help the person to be heard. If we are in fact the object of the emotion, we do the same thing, basically. And then in that case, we may bid for an opportunity to share our own perspective, or apologize, or do whatever is needed for resolution. Sometimes resolution is an agreement to be okay with disagreeing and to commit to listening and respecting each other. I give this example because most people, when they're introduced to empathetic listening, ask, when do I get to tell them what I think about what they are saying? Or they ask, when do I get to address the issue being presented? I understand this impulse, but most of the time people simply want to be heard and are not seeking correction or fixing. The real danger to good listening is trying to correct the emotions being expressed. This is especially important to understand with listening to children. Emotion itself should not be viewed as right or wrong. It may be diminished or exaggerated, but emotion is simply how someone is experiencing something. It's my opinion that we should never correct or punish the expression of emotion. As parents, we do teach self-soothing through helping children take deep breaths, giving hugs, giving encouragements to express anger in healthy ways. In nearly all cases, we, and especially children, long to be heard. And if correction is presented before the emotion is acknowledged respectfully, it's almost universally experienced as rejection. It's important to note that by far most of the time, when we are empathetic, there may be nothing else that is needed. Think story. When you hear a story, you respond with a kind of empathetic emotion that certainly you certainly don't expect to kind of correct what's being shared or presented. You don't say to a character in a movie that they shouldn't have felt a certain way. You listen and empathize. Most of us share our thoughts and feelings like a story. We just want to be heard. I recently had a discussion with a family member on a difficult topic. So this was not about the two of us, it was about a separate topic. And in this case, I felt like I had some expertise, whereas they had kind of a long established position that was different than mine. And because I strongly disagreed with their perspective, at first I was tempted to kind of assert my views and arguments. However, instead, I really focused on listening and understanding what they were thinking and feeling. After a while, I could tell they were feeling heard and respected, and then I started to suggest some of my own perspectives that were different than theirs. While they never fully agreed with me, they expressed things like, I had not thought of that. Or, if I'd known that perspective, I would have found that position easier to understand. So the truth is, if I genuinely care about understanding and empathetic listening to another person, then there's a far greater likelihood that they'll want to hear my thoughts and feelings. This really is a gut check. Do you really want to hear what others are feeling, thinking, and saying? Do they have to agree with you before you will listen to them? These are tough questions we all need to answer for ourselves. And I would invite you to join with me with Jesus to hear his invitation to offer his grace through empathy for others. Know that in doing so, they will be more impacted than if we simply try to correct them. This will help us live more peaceably, even if our opinions differ. Now I'd like to address the issue of the challenges that we face when we're trying to be empathetic. The first one that I notice is really unresolved emotions. So in the work I do, this is the most common example. So someone grows up really being corrected for expressing sadness, being very sad. At some point they experience later a kind of a painful loss. So a death of a loved one or a broken relationship. And so because of that correction, they do not attend to and are not heard in their sadness. They don't talk about it, they don't express it. So then this residual sadness, kind of unprocessed sadness, is something avoided. They don't want to feel their own sadness. So then when they hear someone else expressing sadness, they do the same thing that they do for themselves, and they just simply try to cheer them up. They tell them that sadness isn't helpful. Give them a verse that implies that God will make it okay, so they don't need to be sad, etc. I would encourage you to watch the animated movie Inside Out for a great metaphor on the story of joy and sadness and the importance sadness plays in healthy grief. Another example of unresolved emotions, this is personal. So I grew up the youngest of four in a household where I often felt unheard and even mocked, yes, for my intense emotion. This led to some residual and unresolved anger for me, especially for my early childhood. When my son was very young, I sometimes found myself intensely angry when he expressed anger. This was toxic for him and also for me. Once I embraced my own feelings of anger and learned to express them in a healthy way, I can then hold with empathy and patience the anger I experience in others. The second one is just disagreement, which we've talked about a little bit, but disagreement makes it really difficult to be empathetic. Many times we find this space really overwhelming. An example, this is kind of a simple example, but someone starts expressing anger about legislation passed that I think is great. What do? If I remember that they're not asking me to correct them or help them understand the issue, I can accept the fact that they're wanting to be heard in their frustration. This is difficult for sure. However, in most cases, correction for its own sake is not very loving. If I deeply believe their perspective on this will lead to concrete harm, I will likely look for an opportunity to share my perspective. However, I must focus on first letting them be heard and then seeking permission for them to hear my viewpoint. Oftentimes, people just want to express their emotion and are not looking for correction. Another interesting challenge to being empathetic is exaggerated loyalty. I know this sounds a little strange, but I see this all the time. Sometimes, personally, I have experienced a feeling like I have to make it okay for a specific person or group not in the room. So somebody's just having maybe a legitimate complaint about something that happened that impacted them. And so in this case, certainly loyalty is good, but holding a position on an issue, believing in an organization, institution, or leader, this sometimes can just make it very difficult for us even to slow down enough to listen to and be curious about what somebody's actually feeling. Remember, the emotions themselves do not need correcting. If a change in perspective would be helpful, this may come once the person feels heard and is open to suggestions. Because of the lack of empathy in our culture right now, it feels like no one is being heard, and many people are yelling because they don't feel heard. When that is the case, the only people who are listening are those who agree. This is causing significant division and is certainly not the way Christ invites us to live peaceably as far as it is up to us. Remember, it's more likely you'll be heard if you actually first listen empathetically. Another difficulty and challenge to be empathetic is needing to be right. Kind of similar to disagreement, but it's really, I need to be right for my own sake. So many of us feel this need. I want to be right on this thing. And certainly for me, as the youngest of four, a fairly intellectual family, I often felt unheard. And I found myself for many years trying to assert my thoughts because I needed to be right. I still feel it creep up on me at times. The truth is, the real danger is to assert you are right without humility. Never be wise in your own sight is a challenge to us. While I hold to core beliefs, I now know that I could be wrong on many things and try as best as I can to present my ideas with a certain restraint. In 1 Peter 3:8, Paul encourages us to have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. When I've listened well enough that others feel safe, they'll often ask my perspective on what they are thinking and feeling. Many times, I just pass it back to them and simply ask questions that will help them see what would be helpful for themselves. Interestingly, Jesus asked a lot of questions. The Gospels record several hundred, in fact. Another challenge is the misunderstanding of how truth is heard. So fundamentally, people are struggling to be empathetic because they believe that perspective taking equals agreement. Helping someone feel heard is not the same as agreement. Another way to think about perspective taking is I'm just looking at it from their angle, but I'm not necessarily staying there. So helping someone feel heard is not the same as agreement. In fact, in classic rhetoric, basically the art of disagreement, it is assumed that you're going to understand and be able to repeat the thoughts and feelings of those with whom you disagree. While this still happens in some formal settings, like debate teams where people actually practice presenting both sides of an issue, I do not often see this in our public discourse or hear this in our family dynamics. Truth is best heard when the person with whom you disagree truly feels like they have been heard and respected. Finally, I'd like to take just a little time to talk about being heard. I'm sure for some of you, the idea of empathetic listening to someone, not sharing your own feelings and beliefs, is difficult to understand. You may be asking the question, if they're wrong, shouldn't I correct them? So just pause here for a moment. Let this impulse to be heard enhance your own awareness of how important this is to others. Most people feel like they're close to someone because they are heard by them, not because the other person told them what to think, feel, or believe. So, here are a few thoughts on following up and sharing your own feelings, thoughts, and beliefs once you've gained kind of an honest hearing by listening well. The first idea here is just to ask permission. This might sound obvious, but we often miss this basic idea. Sometimes after hearing a lot of intense emotion and struggle from somebody, I'll simply ask them if they'd find it helpful to hear my thoughts or feelings on what they're dealing with. Many times they say yes, but sometimes they simply say they're grateful to be heard, but are not looking for any ideas from me. Asking permission is always helpful. With your spouse, child, coworker, friend, boss, they can always say no. But if you've been respectful and empathetic, they're more likely to say yes. In some cases, you can simply first acknowledge their position or feeling, then humbly express yours and give them space to respond. Someone says to me, I don't believe God loves me because nothing ever seems to come from prayer. And I might say in response, wow, that's heavy. I can hear how hard it must be to trust God when it doesn't feel like He hears you. There are certainly times for me when it feels like God doesn't answer my prayers in ways I had hoped. But I do believe from my own experience and the truth of His scriptures that He really does love me, even when things don't seem to go well. It is almost never appropriate to discount what they are feeling, and we have to be careful to address their emotions with an emotional response, even when we share our own ideas. You can hear that in what the example I just gave, responding with emotion. Once you gain a hearing through empathy, believe me, people will be more likely to hear what you are thinking and feeling. Of course, there are times where asserting your voice may be needed if there is a concrete need for advocacy. Telling someone to stop hurting you or others, filing formal complaints about clearly immoral or egregious acts, or when you feel like life or health is at risk. The truth is, being heard is important. When we don't receive empathy, it can be very frustrating and lead to real disconnection. Finding safe people to share our thoughts and feelings with is an important part of self-care and meaningful growth. Don't forget you can request it from trusted family and friends. Demanding others hear us with whom we have no meaningful empathetic relationship, it's honestly a waste of time in most cases. Especially when done to large audiences like social media, it can really cause damage to us and others. Unfortunately, some people never feel safe to share personal feelings with anyone because of the fact that so many struggle to provide basic empathy. Whether venting angrily and sarcastically joking on social media, or never really feeling safe to share with anyone, the truth is that either extreme leads to disconnection. We may find over time that we are no longer in harmony with one another. I would encourage you to remember the simple idea that everyone wants to be heard, and that hearing their story, including their present feelings, thoughts, and beliefs, is a gift of grace we can give nearly anyone we meet. Recognize that your role in most cases is not to fix what someone is feeling or thinking, or to resolve their relationships or circumstances, but your invitation from God is to create a safe space so they feel heard. As followers of Christ, we have the opportunity to introduce them to a God who loves them, died for them, and is very much wanting to hear their story, which may in turn soften a willing heart to receive an invitation to join in his story, the gospel story. I'd like to thank my wife Susan for her many contributions and helps with this material. I'd also like to close with a prayer she wrote during these past few months with this topic in mind. Let us pray. Father of mercies, let us hold to our certainties of how things should be with humility, with compassionate grace for differing views, with a genuine and sincere interest in understanding what deeper desires and fears may be motivating others and us. Grant us patience and the desire to be stretched by our circumstances. Grant us true empathy and the desire to alleviate the frustration, discomfort, and suffering of others. If possible, so far as it depends on us, help us to live peaceably with all. Prince of Peace, may I be so completely filled by your presence that love and brotherly affection flow to all as I excel in showing honor to others. Lord, if possible, so far as it depends on me, help me to live peaceably with all. Amen. If you are still uncertain about what empathy looks like, or if you're dealing with conflicts that are overwhelming, don't be afraid to reach out. I'd be happy to discuss it with you and help you find appropriate resources. Thanks.